I'm Janice Switlo. Today I want to discuss this common knowledge that wars are often fought between brothers. There can be no more brutal or more bewildering of battles than those that divide a family against itself. Right now, there's a lot of this going on within Indigenous nations. There's a lot of people who dictate this is the way it has to be done. This is what we must do. Individuals competing and approaching issues, very passionate, very concerned, wanting to get something done instead of all this talking. I get that. But the problem is that they're being pitted against each other, brothers against brothers, as this is said. And Canadian governments have worked diligently to foster that kind of an atmosphere, because of course if you're fighting each other, you don't have a lot of energy left or any ability really to focus on the real issues and your real threat. And there's a number of ways that that's done. Certain factions are funded. We all know about certain funding approvals that happen just before elections to facilitate a distribution. Those funds are never applied to the project, the quote-unquote project that got approved. It really was a funneling of federal monies into the hands of a preferred incumbent chief to ensure that they retain that position. Why? Because the chief's working along with and complicit with the goal to assimilate, right? So I want to just touch briefly upon the kinds of things that I would encourage you to turn your attention to. I've spoken earlier about how the circle works and how it's in the process of doing that the guidance and the direction will come. And until such time as those circles can be formed again and differences can be put aside, it can be tough. But it's really, really important, if you're going to say you're sovereign and retain your nationhood and retain your economic sovereignty, why are you going to UN consultation exercises like the Permanent Forum? Why are you not turning your attention to the potential for foreign alliances? You need to, in order to obtain sympathies of other international entities of which you are a part, you need to project strength, and you need a sense of unity to create international respect. Going to the UN Permanent Forum and participating in what I see as simply a bitch session, right? Someplace to feel like you're being heard, nothing gets done. What that whole process facilitated was an exportation of the Canadian pilot project that Pierre Trudeau Sr. initiated in Canada, which has become the Section 35 doctrine. He put it in place through his friend, the Justice of the Supreme Court of Canada, Antonia Lemaire. And I've set out a history and background of that Section 35 doctrine. So instead of going along with lawyers that say, okay, we can do a big case and you're going to spend a lot of money doing that. Instead of flying to Geneva and flying to New York to sit in on these, consultation meetings. Instead, working on projecting your strength and a sense of unity and working to create that international respect. And what are the kinds of exercises that are involved? You begin working on a consular convention, to define diplomatic relations between your nation and other nations. And I'm not talking your Indian band. I'm talking the big N nations. Look at your linguistic borders, not Indian Act borders. You look to working on preparing plans for your governance, for setting guidelines for negotiations negotiation of foreign alliances. You start putting in place your council that doesn't have authority to sign for you and decide for you. They're liaisons, they're diplomats. And there's different ways these things can be done. When I talk about, properly planning for your governance, I'm not talking about these election codes and membership codes and constitutions. You don't need a constitution, you have one. It's thousands of years old, and it's the oldest in the world. And you're still here and you're still functioning. It's been buried. You've been told it doesn't matter. Those flames, those embers need to be fanned. And you can't do that when you're fighting over which federal initiative you should opt into or not. There can be lots of time later to consider those things. If you do want to actually assimilate, if you find that standing on your own, protected with a strong partner in the crown, you feel later you don't want that for whatever reason, then go exploring. Nothing that says you should never do that. But the reality of it is, most people making decisions today were in residential school. They were indoctrinated into a way of thinking that's not very healthy. And there's very sick communities and families out there as a result, as they've passed on their trauma to their families. And there has not even been any attempt to use the tools that are available to nations. Anytime a lawyer, for example, is consulted, the only thing they know is domestic Aboriginal law. That's not Indigenous law. That's not your nation's law. That's not international law. And in the process of doing this and exploring this, it's critical that the treaties remain binding on the Crown. Without those treaties recognize you as nations. Those treaties protect you. And it's important to understand that with those treaties in place, you don't implement promises, you keep them. Isn't that rather trite to say? But instead of Canadian governments keeping the promises, because the Crown needs to act through her governments, instead of keeping the promises, they speak about, we need to implement this. Those treaties are in full force and effect. When you say we need to implement a treaty, you're saying the treaty is not in full force and effect. It is. You get your $5 every year. That's proof enough. And, the governments, instead of keeping those promises, are tricking you and spending tons of money to get you to, put in place, self-government within the concept and within the confines of federal policy. So, and I'll leave you with one last thought on this as the work proceeds. And that is, a lot of people will mouth off and say, treaties were a mistake. Let's put an end to the treaties. Let's deport people. They get in some of the loose language, you see on Facebook and social media. It kind of sets people up to, and I'll warn you, to get caught by the Anti-Terrorism Act. Now remember, you make mistakes. You use terms that say, I'm a domestic ethnic minority member. I'm just a remnant. Now, you would never use those terms in full. You might use one term. But anything that snags the Section 35 doctrine, you're taken to be saying that. As soon as you're doing that, as soon as you're not acting diplomatically, as soon as you threaten the peace, Canada's all ready and all set to apply certain laws. And you might as well, with all due respect, be advocating suicide, because as a solution, when you say there's no treaties and this isn't what we did. Well, don't confuse the lie about what those treaties are in law with what they actually are. When people say, these treaties are no good, we didn't do that. Yeah, the treaty itself says you didn't do that. But others will try to convince you that the treaty means something different, that it was a sale, that the use of the word surrender and cede says you sold. they don't know anything. These people are saying that. The people who are receiving that information don't understand what to have and told means. Again, there will be a special session to explain all that. So I really caution you. Those treaties are put in place. They're there to protect you. You need to build upon that. Those treaties say to the world, this is an international entity. Canada is busy painting the picture and setting up de facto scenarios to say, no, you don't agree with that. You always have seen yourselves as part of Canada. We're making space for you now, and we know we haven't done a great job of including you, but that's going to change. Don't believe that. Your strongest position, what you need to do is stand strong as a nation, project that sense of unity, show your strength, and you show your strength by using the correct words and not speaking Section 35 in doctrinal language. That's all I have to say.